Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's June 30th, 2021, and I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we're discussing environmental education and the importance of spending time in nature to both human health and environmental conservation. Our first guest is journalist and author Richard Louv, who coined the term nature deficit disorder with his landmark 2005 book, Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. Louv discusses the international movement kicked off by the publication of Last Child in the Woods and what the latest research says about the connection between nature deficit disorder and a variety of physical and mental ailments. He also tells us about his newest book, Our Wild Calling, how connecting with animals can transform our lives and save theirs.
For all of human history, people went outside during their developing years in the natural world, and that's where it happened. That's where we became human. But within the last few decades, it's been a stark contrast.
We're also joined by Megan Strauss, an editor with Manga Bay Kids, Manga Bay's own site dedicated to providing kids, families, and educators with content that helps raise awareness of environmental issues and fosters an appreciation of plants, wildlife, and wild places. Strauss tells us about the goals of Manga Bay Kids, gives us a preview of some upcoming content, and discusses the importance of environmental education.
We think that environmental education is really critical. We don't live in isolation from nature. We depend on it for food, resources, medicine, for our health and physical and mental well-being. So it's really essential that throughout our lives we connect with nature, we educate ourselves about nature, we become aware of what's going on.
Richard Louv says that he coined the phrase nature deficit disorder to facilitate discussion of the human cost of alienation from the natural world, an urgent problem he felt many people were aware of intuitively, even if they lacked the language to adequately describe it. The term nature deficit disorder and the book that introduced it to the world, Last Child in the Woods, have since inspired an international movement aimed at connecting children to nature. Humans have been moving toward increasingly urbanized societies and living more of their lives indoors ever since the advent of agriculture, Louv says, but social and technological innovations made over the past 3 decades have made people more disconnected from nature than ever before. He cites the proliferation of electronic communications, poor urban planning and disappearing open space, increased street traffic, diminished importance of the natural world in public and private education, and parental fear magnified by news and entertainment media as some of the chief causes of nature deficit disorder. Spending less time outdoors has led to a wide range of behavioral problems for human beings, especially children, he argues, though even he is quick to point out that nature deficit disorder is not recognized in any of the medical manuals for mental disorders.
I'm always careful to say that it's not a known medical diagnosis. Maybe it should be, but it's not yet. It is, however, a phrase that helps us talk about the disconnect between not only children and nature, but all of us from the natural world. It was the theme of Last Child in the Woods, the first of these 4 books that I've written about our connection to the natural world. And at the time, in 2005, this was not on the burner of the stove, let alone the front burner. This discussion about this unprecedented disconnect between children and nature, which means the rest of us with nature as well. For all of human history, people went outside during their developing years in the natural world, and that's where it happened. That's where we became human. And just within the past few decades, even though there obviously industrialization and the invention of agriculture pushed us away from nature to a degree, but within the last few decades, it's been a stark contrast. So nature deficit disorder was a way to talk about that. And my experience was that people knew this was happening, parents in particular, but we didn't have a way to talk about it. We didn't have a term for it. And once once nature deficit disorder became a kind of meme, and I realized at the time it was kind of a corny phrase, but it worked. And now it's entered the language. In fact, it's entered several languages. The book is now in, I think, 23 languages, 23 translations. And what has emerged from it is a movement that I think can fairly be called a movement that is now across the United States. It's in education, it's in healthcare, it's in urban planning, and it's in other countries too. And it's growing. And the implication of that is that not only kids will be better connected to the natural world, but all of us will.
Since 2005, when you introduced this concept of nature deficit disorder to the world and this movement really began, what do you think has been the trajectory in terms of our disconnect from nature? Have things like video games and the internet, which we seem to only becoming increasingly obsessed with as a culture, made it worse? Or are we coming up with solutions and really grappling with it?
Well, I think we're grappling with it. There are several causes, and you've mentioned one of them, which is video games and electronics and all that. And I'm always careful not to demonize kids playing video games and spending time on their smartphones. And it's a practical reason. Anytime adults demonize anything, kids want to do more of it. But also there's another reason, which is if we place too much of the responsibility of this on technology, we'll be stepping away or ignoring other deep reasons that also exist. One of them is bad urban design. People get told to take a walk. Walk where in many neighborhoods? If you're lucky, you might find a Starbucks. Go outside in nature in your neighborhood. Well, many of these neighborhoods that have been built during the last 40 years are gated communities. They have community associations that, just try to step on the grass, let alone build a treehouse for a kid. There may be green, but it's off limits. That's for the more affluent kids, but for kids within neighborhoods that are in inner cities, for example, there's very little nature there. There is always nature everywhere. There's birds everywhere, and it can be found, but nature is not accessible. And, we've really learned that in the pandemic when we realized, many of us, how important nature was for our mental health, our physical health, our sense of not being alone in the universe. And then we looked around and we saw, where is that nature? And many of the neighborhoods, the parks are either not there because of inequities in the development of parks, or the parks aren't usable because they're not safe, or they're not set up for nature. They're set up for soccer or basketball, which is fine. We need organized sports. But so these other reasons, in addition, there's the fear of stranger danger, which has grown exponentially in recent decades. Even though, at least until recently, crime was going down for about 40 years, violent crime toward children outside the home. What was going up is violent crime toward children in the home. The more they were sequestered in their home and under what amounts to protective house arrest, the higher the rate of child abuse within the home became. And then there's one more reason. In the most recent book, Our Wild Calling, which is about our relationship with other animals, I write about all of that, but I also suggest that our disconnect with nature, as well as with each other, has led to what's widely known as an epidemic of human loneliness. The medical communities have really focused on that in recent years, that human loneliness, isolation, has many of the same disease effects on people as obesity and smoking. And it's growing exponentially, in not only the United States, but around the world. I make the case that all of those things that I just mentioned, which happen to be the reasons that kids aren't getting out in nature very much, also apply to adults. All of those also are part of the reason for the epidemic of human loneliness. And I make the case in Our Wild Calling that human loneliness is rooted in an even deeper kind of loneliness, which is species loneliness. As a species, we're desperate not to feel alone in the universe. It's one of our characteristics. Why else would we look for Bigfoot? Why else would we look for intelligent life on other planets when it may not be a good idea to find it? It's because we don't want to be alone in the universe. And the irony is, obviously this has religious implications, but the irony is we're not alone in the universe. We're not alone in the world. We're surrounded by a great conversation going on all the time. The more that science has learned about how animal species and plant species communicate within their own species, but also across species, the more we realize that conversation is going on and that we can be a part of that conversation if we pay attention. During the pandemic, I wrote about this in a piece for the LA Times. People looked out their window and they realized there were birds out there. They realized there was wildlife in their backyard, if they were lucky enough to have a backyard. Or on the window ledge across the street, they watched a raptor build a nest and they did not feel so alone. This became very important to people during the pandemic, and I think it will continue to be important. We've seen that huge rush to trailheads now that continues. The parks are crowded now because people have realized just how important nature is to their solace, their sense of not being alone in the universe, and their sense of healing.
So you think a lot of people are just coming to the realization that they need more nature in their lives on their own?
Nothing concentrates the attention on that like a pandemic. I no longer have to work so hard. And the people who are involved in this movement no longer have to work so hard to convince people that being in nature is good for their physical health, their psychological health, their cognitive functioning. That really has surfaced more since the pandemic began than it has in the past. We've been working on this for a long time, and attitudes have changed. There's a survey that was done, I think, 3 years ago that repeated some research that Stephen Kellert at Yale did about 20 years ago. It was about attitudes of Americans toward nature. But what they found was one of the big things that had changed was that parents in particular had realized that nature was important for the development of their child, for their health and psychological development, cognitive skills, and all of that. That had skyrocketed within the last 15 years. What's not changed a lot are the barriers. The barriers are still there. We have a lot of work yet to do.
What are some of the institutional solutions that have been implemented over the years? You mentioned the concept of nature deficit disorder has impacted education and healthcare. What does that look like? With education, for instance, is that just something as simple as more outdoor education, teaching classes outside and just getting kids out of the classroom more often?
Well, first, it starts a little earlier than that with research in higher education. When I wrote Last Child, I could find about 60 studies that I could with confidence quote. And there were a few volunteers, a few pioneers. They were volunteers and pioneers. Academics who were really studying this, beginning to study it in the early 2000s, but very few. I mean, this was literally the elephant in the room. How could something this large be ignored for so long, virtually, by the academic world? So I could find about 60 studies. Today, if you go to the Children in Nature Network website, which is the nonprofit that grew out of Last Child in the Woods, you can go to a free research library that we've created so that anybody in the world can go and find the latest research on the importance of connecting all of us, not just kids, but adults, to the natural world. It's gone from 60 studies to well over 1,000 studies during that time. And they're still coming in at 10, 20 a month from someplace in the world. So this has now become something of a growth industry. That's a fundamental change, and it's extremely important. Many students, college students, are now focusing on this as their major. They're beginning to look at how they, in education schools, how they can create nature-based schools and all of that. The other thing that is happening, but not fast enough, is the transformation of schools. One of the things that has been learned from that research is that many kids, maybe most kids, learn better when they do at least some of that learning outdoors. And it's not just about science and nature that they're learning. It's about all the topics. It's the English teacher who takes the kids out and sits under the trees and writes poetry, and they write poetry. It's the geography teacher. It's the biology teacher who takes the kids down to the creek at the end of the schoolyard and actually believes that kids, in order to learn biology, need to get their feet wet and their hands muddy. That is going on. There are a lot of individual teachers, I like to refer to them as natural teachers, that were doing that long before Last Child in the Woods came along, but there are a lot more of them now. And they don't get a lot of honor. I think we need to start recognizing those teachers who kind of defy the odds. They often defy their own administration and get their kids outdoors to learn. But what's also happening is the growth of nature preschools. During the last 15 years, the number of nature-based preschools, and these are schools that the kids go outside and spend much of their time learning outdoors In Europe, these are more popular. They're called forest schools more often there. And some of these forest schools in Europe have no buildings. They just spend all day. And it doesn't matter what the weather is. There's no bad weather, just wrong clothes. And that's not a new thing in Europe, but in the United States, it's a very new thing. So the number of nature-based preschools has skyrocketed in the last 15 years. There's hundreds of them now. And there was, maybe 8 15 years ago. Hundreds is still not enough. We need many more. In terms of the mainstream education schools, the junior high and grade school and high school, in public schools, it's a slower movement. In private schools, there are a lot more of those. There's high schools that are focused on nature-based learning. But in public schools, it's slow, and the pandemic has illustrated that. Again, it's another lesson we've learned. In 2015, during the tuberculosis epidemic, there were outdoor classrooms on the tops of New York City high-rises. The outdoor classroom became very popular, and in fact, it was for social distancing. And that spread around the country. The New York Times did a great story about that a few months ago. This time in a pandemic, when we were literally talking about social distancing. I mean, my brother is a high school teacher in Northern California. He was told to go back to his school in August, and the chairs were 3 feet from each other in a high school. The desks were 3 feet apart. The ventilation was terrible. There was really very little provision for social distancing. And the idea that they might set up outdoor classrooms was not even discussed. Where I live now in Julian, California, which is a little town east of San Diego, up in the mountains, the high school went back to business, and kids were not required to wear masks, at least at the beginning, during the pandemic, even though there are some big camps up here, summer camps, that one of them in particular, YMCA camp, called the school district up here and offered the camp as a giant outdoor classroom if they wanted to bring their students there for social distancing and for learning in nature. They never heard back. So we have a long way to go in terms of changing our schools, but there are great teachers out there who are determined to do this. And I hope there's a few good superintendents out there that have learned from the pandemic how important learning outside can be.
And what about healthcare? How is more exposure to nature being brought into healthcare?
It's probably moving equally or faster in healthcare, which was a real surprise to us. In 2010, I was asked to give the keynote to the American Academy of Pediatrics, their national conference. I was surprised to be asked. I mean, nature deficit disorder, really? Even though I always qualify that as not a known medical diagnosis. But I was asked, and I went up to San Francisco, and there were about 5,000 pediatricians and pediatric nurse practitioners and others. And I was astonished at the response. I learned later that this really positive response, physicians saying they were going to go back and change their practice, comes largely because pediatricians, even more than other doctors, much more than other doctors, know that what they do is, while we say it's evidence-based, the fact is that pediatricians prescribe medications every day that have never been tested on children with good reason. So they know that there's a certain art to this that is not covered by research. So they were perhaps more open. The second reason they were more open is they were frustrated. Pediatricians were getting pushed to write prescriptions for Ritalin. Some kids need Ritalin and Adderall and other medications. I'm not anti-medication for kids with Ritalin, but not all of them. Many kids, the symptoms may indicate something else. Teacher after teacher has told me over the last few years that the kid who is the troublemaker in class, when they get the class outdoors, if they're lucky enough to do that, to learn, that kid becomes the leader, not just better behaved, the leader. Often those kids are on pharmaceuticals because of attention deficit disorder. So changing the atmosphere in which the learning takes place, getting those kids out from behind those desks where they spend hours and hours, locked into a lockstep kind of learning, helps those kids. I often think about the junior high kids sitting at the back of class wearing black, and the goth kids who have the chip on their shoulder and all of that. How many of them who have been medicated, many of them, actually need something else? How many of them are those leaders the teacher tell me about when they get those kids outdoors? So the pediatricians have been frustrated because they've seen a rising suicide rate among children. They see rising rates of disease because of obesity, a sedentary generation growing up. And they're asked to fix that as pediatricians, and they know they can't fully do that because childhood has changed so radically. So the idea that they can begin to prescribe nature to the families is a radical idea, but they've begun to do it. There's a physician named Dr. Robert Zarr who was at that speech. And he went home and he organized his fellow pediatricians in Washington, D.C. to start literally writing prescriptions to families for nature, to go outside. They didn't stop there. They created a database of all of the parks in Washington, D.C. in open space, so they could not only write the prescription, but the doctor could look at the computer next to himself or herself and then turn to the family and say, there's a park a block and a half from your house, and here's what you can do there. This idea is spreading. It's something that pediatricians feel really good about, and we're lucky they're moving in that direction. It's starting to affect the rest of healthcare to a degree also. Psychologists and others are seeing the same thing. There's been a big increase in the number of ecotherapists or that practice ecopsychology that actually do their therapy outdoors, and they find that with many people it works much better than sitting in the cubicle.
You mentioned earlier that many communities in the U.S. simply don't have access to outdoor spaces. And that reminded me of an episode of this podcast we did earlier this month about the Biden administration's 30 by 30 conservation plan, which specifically calls for creating more safe outdoor opportunities in nature-deprived communities. Do you think that's in some ways a direct response to this movement?
I don't know if it's a direct response. I know the Obama administration did some things that were quite direct. Sally Jewell, the Secretary of Interior at that time, really took this seriously and has helped us a great deal. Also, I was invited to help launch the White House initiative that called Every Kid in a Park, that guaranteed all fourth graders in America free access, a free ticket for a whole year, along with their families, to any federal lands or waters, like national parks and so forth. So there have been some very specific things that have happened because of this movement. I'm not saying it's because of the book. Again, there's tens of thousands of people out there who are working hard on this, not only in the United States but other countries. But I think that this discussion is gaining traction, is gaining speed. In addition to Biden talking about more access to nature within areas where it's not accessible to a lot of families, there's also the issue of biodiversity collapse and climate change that he's moving on, at least on paper, pretty quickly. And in Our Wild Calling, I talk about the need to not only set aside nature for people, but to set aside nature for wildlife, to turn around this biodiversity collapse that's going on. I don't know how much time we have to do that, but it's got to be done. So those two things go hand in hand, though. In the Nature Principle, the second of these two books, I talk a lot about cities and a lot about urban design and how we can, I ask the question, what would it be like if our lives were as immersed every day in nature as they are in technology? That has a lot to do with urban design and where we live. Biophilic design is gaining traction. That's the kind of architecture or urban design that weaves nature into say, a workplace building that's being constructed, weaves that in from the beginning and keeps it there, both outside the building and inside the building. Biophilically designed workplaces, the studies show that the workers are far more productive, turnover gets better, sick time goes down, creativity goes up. The same is true for biophilically designed schools. Why couldn't we have biophilically designed whole cities in which you see that kind of payoff? And we're moving toward that. Not fast enough, but a lot of the best minds now are beginning to think in that direction.
You've already discussed some of the research looking into nature deficit disorder and its causes and effects. Can you tell us about some of the latest findings?
I don't know if these are the latest, but these are some of the ones that have caught my attention along the line. Attention deficit disorder, University of Illinois, doing an ongoing set of studies on this, has found that kids in an urban setting, walking in an urban park, just walking through trees in an urban park, the kids with the symptoms of attention deficit disorder, those symptoms get better. It doesn't take a lot to begin to relieve kids of attention, from attention difficulties. Creativity goes up. Studies of natural schoolyards compared to the typical asphalt or cement playground. The kids who play in the natural schoolyard play differently. They're far more likely to invent their own games. That has everything to do with the development of executive function. And that has everything to do with future entrepreneurs, with people who learn how to be their own boss. And, and it has, I believe, I've thought about this more recently, it has a lot to do with the future of democracy too. If kids are growing up being told to do everything by adults and never get a chance to create their own games and their own reality, then we got a problem. The other thing that happens on natural play spaces is that kids are far more likely to invite other kids who are not like them to play. Kids of a different color, different race, different culture, different gender, different economic level. They're far more likely to invite kids who are not like them to play with them on a natural play space. I've made the argument that when we talk about social capital, which is, how many people there are to help you if you get in trouble. How many people can you call? That's one of the definitions of social capital. That's been going down in cities in particular, but it's been going down in rural areas also. But why is it that when we talk about social capital, we only talk about one species? I think that we need to begin to look at the other animals, not only our pets, but wildlife in our cities and all of that, as part of our social capital. And we've seen that in the pandemic when people began to take great solace in the animals that they saw right outside their windows. There's a lot of other research. Physical health, one group tested on an indoor in an indoor gym on treadmills compared to people who burn exactly the same number of calories, but do it outside in green exercise, hiking or gardening. The adults on the indoor treadmills get healthier, their blood pressure gets better, their psychological outlook gets better. The kids, the people who burn exactly the same number of calories, but do it in green exercise outdoors in nature, get even better. We don't quite understand that margin of improvement, even though it's the same number of calories burned. But there are a lot of theories about that.
I read in a blog post on your website that there's research showing nature deficit disorder also weakens ecological literacy and stewardship of the natural world, which seems significant because the obvious conclusion would seem to be that the more kids are exposed to nature, the more interested they will be in conserving it when they're actually adults making decisions about conservation. Is that fair to say?
It is. There are studies done in the past of looking at what are the influences on adults who become conservationists, environmentalists, who have a conservation ethic. And one of the common denominators, a strong common denominator, is almost all of them had a personal connection to nature when they were kids. What happens when that goes away? David Sobel, who's someone else who writes about this that I admire, and I read about him and his idea in a couple of these books, of these 4 books. David writes about what he calls ecophobia. And what that is it's not just the access to nature, but what kids learn about nature. Before kids are even 2 years old, they're being overloaded with all kinds of messages coming from the TV and from their parents that it's over, that nature is done, that climate change, biodiversity collapse, all these things. they're getting this bad news. Not that it's not true, most of it, but they're overloaded at an age inappropriate, at an inappropriate age in their development. So what do they do with that information? First, this takes place before or instead of going outside just to experience nature, just for the joy of it. So what do they associate nature with for the rest of their lives then? During those formative years, they learn that nature is a threat. Nature is dying. Nature, it won't be here when they're adults. And he calls this ecophobia. This fear of nature fits right into the fear of strangers. That is one of the main reasons that kids are disconnected from nature. I'm not saying we shouldn't teach kids about the bad news and how to make it better. But David Sobel makes a very strong case that if we do that too soon with kids, before they even have a chance to learn to love nature and to get their hands muddy and their feet wet, then we're doing them a great service. From that point on, they're associating nature with disaster and fear. I think there will always be environmentalists, but if we're not careful, future environmentalists are going to be more likely to carry nature in their briefcases than in their hearts. And that's not a sustainable relationship.
So then you generally agree with David Sobel that we need to instill a love of the natural world in kids before we hit them with the cold, hard truth about the environmental crises we're facing?
Yeah, absolutely. And there is an environmental education is going through a change too. It's not just the data. Environmental education has been, I think, too much focused on the classroom. And in fact, after Last Child came out, there were some environmental educators who didn't consider what I was talking about to be environmental education. Understandably, they were focused on natural systems, on climate change, on biology and lab biology and all of that, that mainly was dealt with in the classroom. But you're seeing more and more environmental education educators begin to move that classroom outdoors. And it's not that the classroom education needs to be set aside at all. It's that we need to expand the classroom. So, I absolutely think that's very important.
What is the distinction between environmental education and reestablishing a connection with nature? Are they the same thing?
Not necessarily. That's kind of what I was saying in an inarticulate way. We need both. We need the kind of environmental education that comes from books and videos and slideshows and all of that. We need that kind of education, as well as the kind of education that comes from, testing water pH levels and all of that. But we also need education that allows people to connect with their heart. And that's the thing that has been missing the most. And I want to add here that this isn't just about kids, that this connection, in order to maintain our sense of hope, in order to maintain our caring about the natural world, we have to go out and bond with it all through our life. And in fact, the case for doing that is not only to care more about nature in order to protect it, it's to care about ourselves. It's to relieve ourselves of the despair that so many people feel. And then they feel that relieved. They feel it lighten when they go for a walk in the woods. That type of self-therapy has to expand, because we're right now not in a hopeful time. It's tough to watch the news these days, and we're going to need all the hope we can get. And I think that this personal connection to nature for people of all ages is one of the things we have to do in order to make any progress at all.
Before we wrap up, I did want to ask you to tell us a little bit more about your latest book, Our Wild Calling. It focuses more on human-animal connections and coexistence. How can humans connecting more with wildlife change our lives and lead to better protections of animals' lives?
Well, one of the reasons that I wrote Our Wild Calling was, those over 1,000 studies that I mentioned. When you look at them closely, almost all of them are about green space, the impact of green space and vegetation on people. Now, there's kind of an assumption that there's some animals in that green space, but very little research has been done specifically on the impact of wild animals on human beings, other than, Sometimes we're a little lower in the food chain than they are. But the impact of them positively on us has been not attended to as it should be. So that was one of the reasons to look into it. And I collected stories, hundreds of stories from people around the world, and I didn't obviously use all those stories, in which people told me about encounters with wild animals, but also their relationships with their pets, which is also important. And more research has been done, way more on that, on animal-based therapy using domestic animals. But they told remarkable stories, wonderful stories, and they had common denominators. Sometimes I was the first person they told their story about this encounter with a wild animal that changed them, because they were a little embarrassed to tell the story. Right now I have a cat on my desk. He's making noise. I'm sorry.
No problem.
I'm having an encounter with my cat. And the stories were wonderful, and they had common denominators. There's Paul Dayton, an oceanographer at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, talked about being grabbed by a giant octopus on the bottom of the ocean and running out of air, realizing he was running out of air right there. It was one of these giant octopuses with 12-foot wingspan. And as he kicked off with his last strength, and as they went up through the column of water, the octopus began to move around his body, and he could feel the razor sharp beak of the octopus on his neck until he was looking into the octopus's eye. Now, Paul is a highly respected oceanographer, one of the most famous among oceanographers. He's a hardcore scientist, but he said something happened in that moment that he can't explain. He makes a joke of it. He says, I think maybe the octopus and I made our non-aggression pact. But the octopus began to relax and move away from him, but continued to go up with him. And then they both hit the surface. Paul looks down in the water, and there's the octopus still looking at him. They're making eye contact still. And then the octopus turns and starts to go down into the darkness. What does Paul do? He puts the mask back on and chases the octopus back down into the darkness. And then until he runs out of air, and then he came back. I said, Paul, why in the world would you do that? He can't explain it. He uses the word spiritual with some embarrassment. He doesn't know if it's spiritual, but it felt that way. And one thing he knows for sure is that he did not want those moments to end. Again and again, I heard people have encounters with deer, with jaguars, with mountain lions, with even a paramecium. And they often had these characteristics of an almost altered states that people go into where, for instance, time either bends or disappears. That happened to Paul. Or their sense of space changes radically. Their sense of scale changes radically. And then they feel this thing happened that they have no explanation for. The search of the book is, what is that happens between us and a wild animal or a pet during those kinds of encounters? The closest I could get was a great essay by the philosopher Martin Buber. I always have to be careful not to say Justin Bieber. And he wrote a great essay called I and Thou. Basically, he said that you and I don't exist. Not really. What exists is between us. It's the relationship. And without that, you and I don't exist. Now, he used relationship in a different way than you and I might. He meant it as a space between us that contains a kind of electricity that some people call God. Person after person who's told me these stories describes something very similar. I've had experiences, and I write about these in the book, that I felt that. I felt that. I like to name things, as you have already guessed, and that thing that happens does not have a name. So I named that the habitat of the heart. I believe there are two habitats. There's the physical natural habitat that we work so hard to protect and nurture and teach our kids about, as we should. And then there's a second habitat, the habitat of the heart, what is between us and the rest of life, the rest of nature. And we do very little to protect and nurture that habitat of the heart or teach our kids about it. But the thing is, if one of those two habitats goes, so does the other one. I think this has a lot to do with the future of environmentalism and conservation, and the future of the human race. We've got to begin to shift some of our attention as much as possible, not away from the natural habitat, the physical habitat, but to add the habitat of the heart to our concern, to our experience, and to what we tell our kids about.
Right at the beginning of our conversation today, you said that being close to nature is important for people because nature is where we learned to be human. Will you elaborate on that a bit and relate it to why we need to address our society's nature deficit?
There's a lot of ways to answer that. I'll answer it a couple ways. One is the scientists who study the human senses no longer talk about 5 senses. They talk conservatively about 9 or 10 human senses. And some scientists who study human senses say that we have as many as 30. And in the books, in all of these books, I talk about what some of those senses are that we don't use or that we neglect and they atrophy. Here's what we do. We set kids in front of computers and ourselves in front of computers, and we spend a lot of energy trying to block out those other senses, possibly as many as those 30 senses. We're setting up educational and living circumstances for our kids and for ourselves in which we spend all that energy blocking out most of our senses so we can get down to about 2 senses and allegedly go anywhere in the universe through the internet. If we're spending that much energy blocking our senses, that to me is the very definition of being less alive. What parent, what teacher wants their kids to be less alive? I don't think they do. The other way to explain this is to look at the definition for nature. From the beginning of in each of these 4 books, I deal with the definition, and it's tricky, it's difficult. People say, well, we're in nature, we're nature too. How can we be disconnected from nature? And I understand that. I agree. Our language, we're kind of victims of our language in many ways. That very disconnection that we feel has something to do with the way we talk about nature. However, we're kind of stuck with this language. So I've come to think that when we say we are disconnected to nature, what we're most disconnected from is our nature within us. That is another form, perhaps the ultimate form of disconnection from nature, is the disconnect with our own nature. What will happen, as we move through the Anthropocene, which puts human beings at the very center? E.O. Wilson calls that the age of loneliness, not the age of man, but the age of loneliness. Well, we're going to be down to just a few species, domesticated species, if we're not careful. We're losing that great conversation that we're a part of if we pay attention. We're losing our larger family. And by doing that, we lose ourselves. We lose the best of ourselves. We lose our humanity. This has everything to do not only with our kids and our physical and emotional and cognitive health. It has to do with our very humanity. And anything that is essential to our humanity, we have a human right to that. It's one of the reasons I've argued in these books and also in a cover story for Sierra Magazine in 2019 that we need to begin to consider the human connection to nature to be a human right. But that can only be done in the context of nature's right to be. I think we're coming to a big conversation in the future about the fact that this connection is a human right. And until we consider it that, it'll be patronized. It'll be patted on the head. It's a nice to have, not a have to have, but it is a have to have for our humanity. But again, that isn't the right to destroy nature. Nature has the right to exist too. And we have a right as part of nature, as being nature ourselves, to exist. We need to begin to think about it in that fashion to save our humanity, but also to save the larger family that we're part of, the family of animals and plants.
Manga Bay actually has its own environmental education initiative, Manga Bay Kids, which aims to provide news and inspiration from nature's front line for young readers. The site is edited by David Brown and Megan Strauss, and Strauss is here today to tell us all about it. Last week saw a bunch of content about giraffes go up, for instance, so I asked her to tell us about that as an example of the work Manga Bay Kids is doing.
Yeah, sure. So that was a celebration of World Giraffe Week, which we did in collaboration with the Anne Inner-Stagg Foundation and the Wild Nature Institute. The 21st of June each year is now World Giraffe Day. It's the longest day in the Northern Hemisphere and the longest night in the Southern Hemisphere. So it's a relatively new celebration. And my co-editor, David Brown, and I actually both have a background in giraffe research. So it's something that's pretty dear to the both of us. We wanted to really celebrate this amazing animal. Giraffes are very well loved and recognized around the world, and you'll see them in kids' books and documentaries and on clothes and toys. And obviously, if you go to the zoo, a lot of zoos have giraffes. But what a lot of people don't actually know is that giraffes are vulnerable to extinction in the wild. In fact, there are now estimated to be less than 100,000 giraffes left in the wild, so which is a lot less than the number of African elephants. I think there are about 400 to 500,000 elephants left in the wild. So that's something we wanted to bring attention to, and that's actually one of our goals of Manga Bay Kids, is to raise awareness about animals that people love, like the giraffes, but also about animals that people don't even know about. So, that's why we celebrated World Giraffe Week.
I noticed that there are actually multiple pieces of content, and some seem to have action items. So if a parent is listening to this and their kids happen to love giraffes, what kinds of activities and learning opportunities will they find about giraffes?
So we had a lot of different content for World Giraffe Week. We had some interesting facts about giraffes, why they're cool, and then we moved on to some information about their status in the wild. As I was just mentioning, they're actually vulnerable to extinction, and some subspecies are actually endangered or critically endangered. So we wanted to just put that out there for people to see. And then we have a couple of pieces of content on things you can actually do to help giraffes in the wild by supporting research projects or by just learning more about the animals, telling people about giraffes. So that's something that we have up on the site. We have lots of activities as well. So we have coloring, we have various arts and crafts, we have some videos that we produced with the Wild Nature Institute and the Anne Inner-Stagg Foundation. And so, lots of great content so you can learn more about these animals and what you can do to help them.
So just a little more broadly, tell us about the overall goals of the Manga Bay Kids site and the kinds of content y'all are producing.
Sure. So our mission at Manga Bay Kids is very much the same as the rest of the Manga Bay news platform. So we want to bring high-quality news and inspiration from nature's frontline to our audience. And our target audience is kids ages 6 to 12, but not only the kids, because there's so many other important people in their lives. So it's their siblings, their parents or caregivers, teachers, other educators in their lives. So we want to reach out to everyone. I mentioned that one of our main goals is raising awareness. So that's something that's very important to our mission, not just about animals, but also about plants. That's very significant to us. We feel that plants are often underrepresented in these types of education platforms. So we want to build awareness about plants, and a lot of people don't think too much about or notice the plants that are outside. They may not be able to distinguish different species, and that's something I think many of us around the world have lost, that ability to recognize different plants, and so that's something we want to build awareness about. So awareness building is one of our sort of key goals. A second goal that we have is to really just connect kids with nature, to just inspire and excite them about nature. Nature is for everyone, so regardless of your background or where you live. And we have a global audience, which is terrific. So we have kids visiting the site from Sri Lanka and Australia, the UK, the EU, Central and South America, Russia, China, the US. So we really want to reach out to kids everywhere, in cities, in suburban areas, in rural areas, remote areas. And we also want to represent diverse and inclusive role models on the site. So that's really critical to our mission, so that everyone recognizes that there's a place for everyone in nature. So that's another kind of key goal of Manga Bay Kids. And the last goal that I'll mention is that we want to provide tools to help kids and their families and educators deal with the environmental issues that they're faced with today. So many kids around the world are exposed to plastic pollution or some form of environmental degradation, the impacts of climate change, or even just learning about climate change in school. It can be really overwhelming for kids. In fact, in my personal experience, I've met a lot of kids that have pretty high levels of anxiety because of all the different things that are going on in the environment. So we want to be a place where kids can come, and we have ideas on the website, things that kids can do to support conservation. We have sustainability tips. We want to help kids sort of take control and empower them because when they do take action, it helps reduce some of this anxiety. And kids are naturally hungry to do this kind of thing. They don't want to just sit around. They're very enthusiastic and full of energy, and they want to get out and make a difference. Lots of kids are eager to make change. So that's kind of another key goal of the site.
And there are 2 cartoon hosts to guide kids through the site.
Yep. So on Manga Bay Kids, we have 2 host characters. We have Doug Beedle, who is a dung beetle. So Doug really loves poop, and he loves to dance, and he's a little bit of a businessman, I'd say. He's always looking for new business opportunities. So he's one of our host characters on the website. We also have Sophia Sabre. Sophia is a tree. Sabre tree is a tree that's significant in parts of Central and South America. And she is very different from Doug. She's very sincere, very curious about the world, and loves science, and just loves asking questions. So these are our 2 host characters on Manga Bay Kids. So if you go on the website, you'll see them on the front page. We have a set of comics that introduce Doug and Sophia, just tell a little bit of their backstory. And the reason we picked Doug and Sophia is that they represent invertebrates and plants, which are 2 really important parts of the base of food chains and just important in ecosystems. So that's just a little bit of a fun way to represent our host characters. So those are the characters that we have. Okay, so one of the sections that we have on the site is a field trip with Doug Beedle, and that's where Doug goes around the world meeting role models that are involved in some form of nature research or conservation or nature education. So far we've had interviews with researchers and conservationists studying leopards and apes and elephants and giraffes as well. And we've also interviewed artists, picture book authors. So lots of great role models for kids to meet. And they tell us a little bit about how they got interested in nature and the path that they took to become involved in their respective fields. So that's one section of the site. Another key section of the site is what we call Sophia's Lab, and that's our interactive section of the site. So Sophia's Lab has lots of activities, arts and craft, puzzles and games. We have a section there called Nature Lab, which is resources for educators. And we also have a section in there that's a take action, so some kind of action items for kids who want to get engaged and find ways of helping out, support conservation. The final main section we have of the site is called Doug's Wild Library. And Doug's Library is where we kind of house all the facts and features, news stories, articles. We have photo journals and videos and comics and and we also have readers for young kids. So those are kind of the primary sections of the website.
So I just spoke with Richard Louv, who of course coined the term nature deficit disorder and has written a lot about the impacts of our disconnect from nature. At one point, we were talking about the difference between environmental education and just actually getting out and experiencing nature firsthand. Are there resources or content designed to get kids out from behind a computer screen and into the real world on Manga Bay Kids?
That's a really great question. The website is only 3 months old, so we're still sort of busily building, and we have loads of great ideas. And we do have some ideas along those lines to get kids outside, because obviously the most important thing is that kids get outside, they connect with nature. That's just really essential to sort of healthy development and happy kids. So the website doesn't doesn't replace that kind of outside time. It's just complements it. So we see it as a place where people can come if they spend time outside and then they want to sort of dig deeper into a topic. They come to Manga Bay Kids. They can find some more information, some facts. They can find out how to support the local or international conservation organizations. So that's definitely how we see the website, as complementing that time that kids spend outside, because definitely that's the key thing, just to get kids outside and connecting with nature. But we do have some ideas in development, and we just launched Manga Bay Kids YouTube channel. So there are just a handful of videos on there at the moment. That was launched to coincide with the World Giraffe Week. But we do have some original video content that we're currently developing. So some is on urban ecology, like how kids can get outside in urban areas and connect with nature there. We'll have some videos on plant awareness, and we'll have a series of fun videos on poop, because we have Doug Beedle and everyone loves poop. So that's something that we're busy developing at the moment. But yeah, definitely the environmental education is something to complement time spent outside. And there are kids that have really intense focus and interest in certain aspects of nature or science that would really sort of love to come and dig deeper and spend time on the website when they're not outside doing outside things. So that's kind of how we see the website.
You sort of already touched on this, but another thing I was talking with Richard Louv about was the argument made by authors like David Sobel that we need to help kids fall in love with the natural world before teaching them about problems like biodiversity loss and climate change, lest we instill what Sobel calls ecophobia in children and make them fear nature and believe all hope is lost. How do things like biodiversity loss and climate change come into the content you're producing for Manga Bay Kids? And how do you balance the inspirational side of environmental education with the more dire warnings of impending ecological doom?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. It's something that we think about quite a lot, because in truth, kids are already aware of these things. They're exposed to these issues. I know my kids at school, they did an inquiry-based sort of session on climate change and on endangered species. And so they get a lot of this stuff at school. It's already built into a lot of the curriculums, various school, the curricula. And so I think kids are just exposed a lot. They're exposed by listening to their parents talk about things. They overhear things on TV or on the radio. So I think trying to block them from hearing this information is virtually impossible. They're just little sponges. They pick up on everything. But what we can do is we can present them with sort of a limited amount of this information in a safe environment, and we can then give them tools. As I mentioned, that's something that we think about a lot. So what can they actually do? What can they do about these things? Because they already recognize that there are a lot of problems in the environment, and we want to help them. It's our responsibility as the adults, the parents, the educators, to help them build the resilience that they'll need to take care of these things as they get older. So I think it's not something we can shy away from or ignore. We need to just deal with it head on, and we just need to find ways of giving them hope, because it's not a hopeless situation. Maybe it seems like it sometimes, but it's not. And they are really just so full of energy and ready to live in a different way than maybe we have lived. So I think maybe we spend a lot of time worrying about how they'll react instead of just helping them deal with the issues at hand. So it is something we think a lot about, and we will continue to do research and experiment with the best ways of helping kids with these kinds of issues on Manga Bay Kids.
Can you give us any previews of upcoming Manga Bay Kids content?
Oh, yes, I think so. We have, so one of the things that we like to do is to partner with conservation or research organizations. There are so many amazing organizations that are creating just fantastic environmental education materials, and we like to work with people to help them amplify their message and get it out to a broad audience. So we are currently working on World Lemur Week, which is coming up, and we have some plans in the works for some elephant projects. And yeah, we're really excited about the new Manga Bay Kids YouTube and some of the videos we're creating, and just experimenting with different ideas. So yeah, there's lots of great stuff stuff to come, and we have regular content that comes up on the site every week or two. We have a field trip where we meet with these different role models. We have a weekly sustainability tip that's sort of a comic version that you can come and check out. So there's always something new. Every week we post a few different things. So always something new to check out on Manga Bay Kids.
Sounds like you've got a furry friend there in the room with you. You want to introduce them?
She's actually outside. Her name is Luna. She is 7 months old and extremely high energy. She's chasing my cat right now. She is a Staffy crossed with Labrador and apparently just a little ball of energy. So she's a lot of fun to have around as well. Well, hello to Luna. And just to wrap up our conversation, could you say something about the importance of environmental education for kids? Yeah, sure. We think that environmental education is really critical. We don't live in isolation from nature. We depend on it for food, resources, medicine, for our health and physical and mental well-being. So it's really essential that throughout our lives, we connect with nature, we educate ourselves about nature, we become aware of what's going on in the world around us, we kind of follow nature. So David, my co-editor, likes to describe it as, we may follow our favorite sports teams or celebrities or TV shows, but we should also be following nature. We should be checking in. We should see what's going on instead of just looking briefly and turning away. We really need to be in touch with nature. And environmental education is just a lifelong thing. It's for lifelong learners. It's just a great way to connect with the world around you and to learn more about just the amazing things that are outside. So I mentioned that we love working with other conservation organizations to amplify their message. So if anyone would like to reach out to us, you can do so at kids@mangabay.com. Same goes for parents and educators. If anyone has feedback, if there's some particular resource that you'd like to see, go ahead and get in touch with us. And anyone who is interested in supporting the mission of Manga Bay Kids financially can donate through mangabay.org under the Manga Bay Kids name. Well, I certainly don't want to distract anyone who might be headed to mangabay.org right now to support Manga Bay Kids, but I do have to say that if you enjoy the Manga Bay newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. And another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/mangabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, and just $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Front Line, please head to patreon.com/mangabay to learn more and support the Manga Bay newscast. That's patreon.com/mangabay. You and your friend can join the listeners who've downloaded the Manga Bay newscast more than 250,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Manga Bay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Front Line at mangabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/mangabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @mangabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Manga Bay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.